Can you write a novel in a semester? Yes, you can. My name is Dr. Nina Ellis, and I'm a professor of English, comparative literature, and creative writing here at a university in Egypt. I'm teaching a new course this semester, which will involve writing a novel in 4 months. Today is the 2nd of February, the first day of classes, and by the end of May, the last day of classes, all of my students in this one class will have drafted a 60,000 word novel. And I'm inviting you to come along with us and do the same exercises. Maybe I've lost my mind, but I really want to give it a go, and I'm going to do it too and write my own novel. Now, writing a novel is difficult, and I know this because I've drafted 2 in the past, and so I've chosen to use a book as a guide. The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So far, so obvious, but it's a perfectly structured novel and it's short, so I feel like it's a good choice for this semester. Remember that this is just a first draft that you're going to produce over these 4 months, so we can use Fitzgerald as our guide for this draft and then change whatever we like later and diverge from the example that he's setting us. So, how do we begin? This week, we're not going to actually start drafting those 60,000 words. Don't worry. We're going to focus on creating a narrator who is believable, that's the person who tells the story of the novel, and also on crafting a protagonist who is separate from the narrator, who the reader is interested in. That's the person whose story the narrator is telling. So, in The Great Gatsby, you have Nick Carraway, who's the narrator telling the story, and then Gatsby himself is the protagonist. So let's see how Fitzgerald can inspire us to begin. Let's read the opening of the novel. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you have had. And this is the voice of Nick Carraway, the narrator. He then goes on to describe ways in which that advice from his father impacted the way that he related to people he met in the world. And specifically, he mentions Gatsby. He lists his reactions to all sorts of different people and then says, only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. And then he goes on and tells us a bit about Gatsby. You can read those first 2 pages for yourself, but the important thing to take away is that the narrator, Nick Carraway, tells us something that his father told him often as a child, describes his reaction to that advice, and then talks about how that advice applies to Gatsby, who is the protagonist of this tale. My exercise for my students in our first class today is to list out, firstly, all the sayings that they heard quite often as children in their families. So for example, in my family, my mother often said, boring is as boring does, which I never fully understood, but which I think means that if you say you're bored, you're actually boring. There was also a big emphasis in my family growing up on being a good listener and not talking too much. So in class today, we'll read that opening and then we'll all list out sayings that we heard in our families or our homes of origin growing up. Then each student will swap with another student so that we end up with a saying that we didn't personally grow up with, but that is from someone else's life. They will craft a narrative voice, that means writing from a particular perspective, in which they were very affected by this particular saying. And then we'll repeat that a few times so that everyone in the class is practicing empathizing with different experiences of growing up with that particular saying, talking about the impact that it had on them as a narrator. And they'll see what fits, and that will help them to figure out who they want their narrator to be. Because that saying that Fitzgerald opens with tells you a great deal about the themes of the novel. And the ones that resonate with you or resonate with my students as they do these writing exercises will tell them something about what they want to be the core theme of their novel. So I suggest you do this exercise too. Write down sayings that you heard growing up and either using one of those or, even better, swapping with someone else. Practice writing a few opening paragraphs from the perspective of someone who grew up with that saying at the core of their sense of who they were. And see what sticks, see what resonates with you. That will help you to figure out who your narrator could be. And then next class, I'll tell you about crafting a protagonist. Today, worry about the sayings, these refrains that we hear in our families growing up, and the narrative voice that might potentially go with those, and the narrative values that might go with those. And then next time, we'll start talking about the protagonist. Good luck! And here's where you can find me if you're interested in learning more about my teaching, my research, and my writing. Thank you so much.